Thank you everyone for joining tonight's webinar. I'm Michelle Connolly and I'm with Conservation North. Conservation North is a volunteer collective comprising academics, resource professionals, Indigenous people, forest workers, artists, and many others concerned with wildlife and biodiversity loss in BC. We are based in Dacath lands in Lheidli-T'enneh territory. We recognize that communities of native species and their habitats have a right to coexist with humans, so we promote habitat protection, employing both science and advocacy to change government policies on land management. Tonight's webinar is about active management. Active management is a term often used to gain social license for even more logging in our remaining primary forests. Some of the practices that fall under this umbrella include logging in the wake of insect disturbances and fire, increased logging to so-called mitigate wildfire, and logging for so-called forest health. This evening, we will hear from 3 expert speakers who will help us to understand the origins of active management as a practice and some of the potential consequences in our remaining primary forests. We will hear from 3 speakers, Dr. David LindenmAyer, Dr. Dominick DellaSala, and Herb Hammond, followed by 45 minutes for questions and answers, which will be moderated by Kate Logan. Our session will end at 9 p.m. Please put your questions into the Q&A box and indicate who you'd like your question directed to. Our first speaker is Professor David LindenmAyer from the Australian National University. Dr. LindenmAyer is with the Fenner School of Environment and Society and is a world-leading expert in forest and woodland ecology and conservation biology. He has maintained some of the largest long-term research programs in Australia, with some exceeding 42 years in duration, and developed expertise in forest biodiversity, logging impacts, salvage logging, plantation design, biodiversity in plantations, and multiple disturbance interactions. Professor LindenmAyer is among the world's most productive and most highly cited scientists and has published 50 books and 1,550 scientific articles, including more than 985 peer-reviewed papers in international scientific journals. David was an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow from 2013 to 2018. He is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Science, the American Academy of Sciences, the Ecological Society of America, and the Royal Zoological Society of New South Wales. He was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2014. His research has been recognized through numerous awards, including the Eureka Science Prize, the Whitley Award, the Severity Medal, and the Whitaker Medal. In 2024, he received the McFarlane Burnett Medal for Life Sciences from the Australian Academy of Sciences. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here tonight. I'm working and presenting this seminar on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I'm sure that there are many other people on Indigenous lands on this seminar. So I'm going to work through a presentation. So what I wanted to do for the next 20 minutes or so was give a bit of background to the concept of active management in Australian forests. It's a concept that has started to be socialised more broadly in the Australian forest context, and I think it has some really important issues that we need to talk about. So what active management means in an Australian context is extensive thinning, post-disturbance salvage logging, particularly after fire, but also more recently after windstorms, recurrent prescribed burning, extensive road building and fire breaks, and also this concept of what's called forest gardening, which is really, it's Western industrial forest practice, but it's been rebadged as First Nations logging of native forests or natural forests. So part of this talk is really built around a paper that I wrote with Dominick DellaSala, who you're going to hear from, and a number of authors. This was published earlier this year, and it's really a talk around a paper around some of the key issues associated with active management that really haven't featured in the thinking about potential impacts of this kind of way of managing forests. So in this talk, I wanted to cover some issues around logging and fire, thinning and fire, prescribed burning, and forest gardening, and what's more recently been called cultural thinning. I also wanted to place that in the context of what some of our forests used to look like pre-colonisation, pre-British invasion, and then think about what the future of native forest management is here in Australia. Native forest logging is one of the most contested areas of natural resource management in this country, and it's been that way for at least 5 decades. So some background to this presentation. I've been doing long-term work in forests right across southeastern Australia for more than 4 decades. And fire is a really crucial part of that work. In almost all of our long-term studies, fire has been important, sometimes repeatedly. And so a key part of our work is to look at biodiversity response to fire, but also increasingly what we are seeing are very substantial and highly significant interactions between different disturbances. And we'll get to that in a moment. So I first started doing this in 1983. And so I'm sitting in front of you now disguised as a much older man relative to when I started this in July 1983. So this map shows some of our long-term studies, in particular as they relate to fire. And the relationship between logging and fire is very important, but it's also where we see a lot of misinformation. And so last year I wrote a very grumpy, irritable male syndrome book called The Forest Wars, which puts together a whole series of myths that have been perpetrated largely by industry lobby groups, and then puts together the science to rebut those myths. And this is really important, I believe, in the context of modern natural resource management, because the world is really dealing with an avalanche of misinformation. And I really think it's the 5th rider of the apocalypse, as indicated in this particular cartoon. And so the aim of the book was to expose the myths using science and economics in myth busting, and then to arm people with the ability to push back against misinformation, and in this context, to create a new vision for Australia's forests. And I need to do that because most people would be unaware that native forest logging in Australia produces almost entirely wood chips, paper pulp, and box liners. Almost all of the sawn timber in Australia comes from plantations. And most people are not aware of this. And it's really critical to understand that there are some significant interactions between the history of logging in Australia and what's actually happening in the firescapes that now characterise most of the country. And in an Australian context, Australia is the most fire-prone continent on the planet, and by quite some way. And what we've discovered after a series of fires is that the highest severity fires are occurring at the youngest to intermediate age of the forest. So what we see then are very strong relationships around what we call age-related flammability. And so if we look at this graph here, in this slide, this is the probability of canopy fire on this axis and the age of the forest on the bottom axis. And what happens is that there's a short period of roughly 10 years where there's a very low risk of canopy fire. And then once these forests reach about 10 years, or roughly 10 metres in height, then we see a very steep increase in the risk of a canopy fire, a crown scorch or a crown burn. And it's not until the forest reaches about 50 years old that the probability starts to drop away, with the lowest probability of canopy fire being in the oldest forest. And this curve actually continues to decline as the forest exceeds more than 300 years old. Now we can unpack that further, and we've done this to look at the probability of crown burn in relation to logging and intact forest. And the curve still holds when we look at it in this context. So what's actually happening in Australian forest landscapes is that the young log forests are very flammable, and they're reburning at very high severity. And what's really interesting is that other people, completely independently from us, are now finding the same things. So this is work from the state of New South Wales. Previous work was from Victoria. And what we see is that these authors are finding that fuels available to burn at nearly 1.5 times more often in recently logged sites compared to sites that hadn't been logged for 70 years. So there's this relationship then that affects the difference in flammability between logged and unlogged areas. And if we look at the largest ever fires in Australian history, the Black Summer fires of 2019-2020, what we see here is data that's from 4 million data points for the Forest Fire Danger Index. And so we have scores of roughly 10, which is low for the Forest Fire Danger Index, intermediate values around 20 here in orange, and then extreme of 35 or more. And what we're comparing here is undisturbed or intact forest versus harvested forest under these different Forest Fire Danger Index values for 3 major regions: Victoria, Southern New South Wales, and Northern New South Wales. So this is a distance of nearly 2,000 kilometres with 4 million data points. And really the summary from that information is that log forests always burn at higher severity than intact forests. But the effects is so strong that log forests burning under moderate fire weather still burn at higher severity than intact forests, burning under extreme conditions. So this is really quite a significant outcome. So there's a climate change driver of fire weather, but there's also a forest management effect on fire severity that's very strong. And I think it's really, really salient to recognise that these kinds of effects are being seen not only in places like Victoria and New South Wales, but also southwestern Western Australia, Tasmania. And now there's starting to be studies from elsewhere, including South America, and some work from Eastern Canada, which is my understanding is it's about to be published. And even more recently, just in the last couple of weeks, Dominick sent DellaSala, who you're going to hear from, sent me this paper basically showing the same kinds of issues in terms of the flammability of intensively managed wood production forests. So why does this occur? Well, we've looked at this through an empirical lens in quite a number of published studies. There's extra logging debris in these logged and regenerated forests, which add to the fuel load. The ground layer is much drier, and it loses many of its mesic elements, including tree ferns. The soil is much drier, and that's been quantified in a study in Nature Geoscience led by El Bowd. The architecture of the forest has changed in a way which carries fire from the ground layer to the mid-story to the canopy. So we've got these issues with ladder fuels. We also had problems with flammable young plants in these young early successional forests, and the microclimate is changed. That was work that we documented in logged versus intact forest in 2022. That altered microclimate is hotter, drier, and more variable microclimatic conditions. And the interesting thing amongst firefighters in Australia is that they already know some of these things inherently. So this is a fire map from the 2019-20 fires, highlighting the risks to firefighters when they're fighting a major fire that burnt across the coast of New South Wales. And they're noting hazard reduced in some areas, but high fuel loads due to forestry slash. And I want to come back to the hazard reduction issue because many firefighting agencies now don't call it hazard reduction. They recognise that it's hazard production. Come to that in a few moments. So one of the issues that is raised around active management is this notion that maybe we can reduce fire risks by thinning the forest. And this is something that comes up after every fire season with the background aim, we need to rush around and thin the forest because it's going to make it less flammable. So I'm a scientist. I like to look at data, and we looked at literally thousands of data points, comparing thinned versus unthinned forests, controlling for fire weather, controlling for position in the landscape. And this is really important because often thinning takes place in the more subdued parts of the landscape, and it doesn't take place in the very steep and rocky areas. But that kind of control is often not accounted for in looking at thinning effects. And the answer from looking at two major fires, after the 2009 fires and the 2019-20 fires, this is work published in two separate analyses, the answer was that thinning either had no effect on fire severity, or in some cases it actually led to greater fire severity. And perhaps that we should understand that that's not a surprise. In our forestry manuals, there are lots of warnings about the risks of thinning and fire hazard. And we can actually see some of the reasons for that, and that is that thinning often leads to a lot of debris that's left in the forest. This is the same stand that had been intact and then thinned, and that it ended up being burnt at high severity. And we have literally hundreds of those cases in our sample. So this is a really important issue because thinning is regularly proposed as a way to deal with fire risks in our forests in Australia and indeed overseas. Another issue is that there's extensive fire breaks being put through our forests in the hope of being able to use these fire breaks to limit backburning. And one of the problems is bycatch, where we have very large trees that are cut down because of their safety hazard. And this is taking place over thousands and thousands of kilometres. The latest proposal is for over 6,000 kilometres of fire breaks across the state of Victoria. Now I want to come to a very controversial area. So Australia is really one of the key areas where prescribed burning is recommended to deal with flammability issues in wet forests and dry forests. And the interesting thing about looking at prescribed burning is that there are very few long-term studies. And when you start to look at the literature, you also discover that there's very few robust empirical studies that control for things like fire weather, forest type, and other factors which are undoubtedly important in understanding fire behaviour. So this is work that was published by my colleague Phil Zylstra, looking at southwestern Western Australia, which is the mecca for prescribed burning in Australia. And Phil's work is very sobering when you start to dig into what's gone on, because he's looked in detail at the long-term prescribed burning record, and what he discovered was that prescribed burns are somewhat effective for about 5 to 7 years after the burn has taken place. And this is really fairly consistent with what people had previously thought. But then what happened when he started to look in the long term at the data was that there was an increased fire risk for up to 5 decades after that earlier burn. So what Phil's really discovering is that there's short-term gain, but long-term pain in these environments. And what he also discovered was that the affected forests through prescribed burning are 7 times more likely to burn than older forests. And that this was also an effect that we saw once we started to look at climatic conditions and its influence on fire behaviour and how climate is changing in southwestern Australia. We now have a 25% reduction in rainfall in the last 25 years in these systems. And so what the data actually looks like is that burning is making these forests on average 7 times more flammable for between 43 and 56 years after that early period of forest gain by prescribed burning. And you can actually see this in the data as it's plotted here. So you have this pulse of flammability over that period, and then a decline in flammability as time goes on. So the reality of prescribed burning in an Australian context is that it's about the quality of the burn, not the quantity. So we have a lot of emphasis on burn targets, and those burn targets are often targeted at areas where very substantial, and I mean substantial, like tens of thousands of hectares of forest is burnt, but these are often quite remote from where people live and people's property. And what the data actually shows on house loss is that we need to burn very frequently and very close to where people live. And the burns that are done in very remote areas actually boost the problem of flammability. And normally what happens in our equivalent of Fox News in Australia is that some shock jock will say, well, this is all a problem because we hadn't done enough hazard reduction burns. Well, I say to people, you need to actually engage your brains when you listen to this, because it's not what the data show. The data shows you do your burns very close, you do it very frequently, and these become sacrifice zones, and you don't burn in areas with a long history of an absence of fire. But we also understand from rather catastrophic and sad situations like this. This is the town of Marysville. I used to live in this town. This area had extensive prescribed burning done just a handful of weeks before it was razed by a fire in 2009. Under extreme circumstances, prescribed burning does not work. The effect is overtaken by the influence of weather. Okay, let's come to a very, very cynical approach by the forest industry in Australia to parasitise First Nations corporations and tell them how to log their forests with Western forestry practices. So we've had recent invention practice, and this is a term used by some First Nations elders here in Australia, to invent things like forest gardening and cultural thinning. And this is forest gardening, and you can see it also in other images. And if you can pick the difference between standard conventional clear cuts and forest gardening, then you're better than I am, because I can't, because there is no difference. So the issue here is that Western industrial forestry consulting firms have rebadged conventional logging and termed it forest gardening and cultural thinning to give us this. And it's a way of trying to stay in the game through parasitising these First Nations corporations. We talked about these kinds of issues in this paper that was published earlier this year. I think it's one of the most cynical forms of colonialism that I've seen in 45 years of working in forests. And to me, it's just another form of beads and trinkets to screw over First Nations people. I think it's appalling. Okay, so what we've seen from evidence in Australia and in the rest of parts of the rest of the world is this idea of disturbance-stimulated flammability. And that is that past disturbances change forests in ways which lead to a pulse of flammability. And that pulse of flammability might take several decades to subside for the forest to return to a less flammable state. So Phil Zylstra and I wrote about this in 2004 in a paper in Biological Conservation, where disturbance removes the biomass and the biomass regrows where it acts as fuel, increasing the flammability. So this might be after thinning, after logging, after salvage logging, and even after prescribed burning in some ecosystems. And so we see understory thinning and trait changes that lead to that biomass shifting from being fuel to overstory shelter that leads to reduced flammability. And if people want to have a look at this paper, I'm more than happy to send scientific articles that I've mentioned in this talk. Now, we understand that disturbance-stimulated flammability doesn't apply to every ecosystem, but there are many where it does. And there are a number across the world where this kind of pattern is starting to be seen. So in an Australian context, what are we going to do about extensive flammable forest? Remembering the difference between intact forest and log forest. In parts of southeastern Australia, the effect is there for up to 70 years after forests have been logged and regenerated. So that means that every area of forest that's been logged in my lifetime is more flammable than it would have been if it had been left intact. That's important to understand that. And it's now interacting with the fact that we now have 10 times more forest fire danger index days at an extreme level than we had when I was born 65 years ago. So some management issues here are that we need to grow more old forest because that's where fire severity is lowest. And we need to reduce the factors that contribute to flammability, like logging, and in some cases, hazard reduction burning, in some forest types and some woodland types. And we need to think about salvage logging because it adds to flammability in these systems. And we also need to be aware of high severity fires in rapid succession because we are seeing this right across Australia's landscapes. We're seeing places now that are burning 3 or 4 times in 25 years that should burn no more than once every 75 to 150 years. But we also need to embrace new technologies. We need to detect fires faster and we need to suppress those fires faster in these landscapes where we have excessive amounts of fire. Now, there are some landscapes I know in Western North America where there's a fire deficit, but that doesn't apply to our situation where we've got enormous amounts of large-scale, high-severity fire. So we're now looking at lightning forecasting because there are places where we're much more likely to get lightning. We're looking at ignition detection with drone fleets, where we can detect a fire within 5 to 10 minutes with the right density of drones. We're looking at the appropriate analytics and communications for detecting those fires, and then looking at new generation drones that can have payloads of up to 5,000 kilos to drop fire suppressant, fire retardant, and payloads of water. So we're looking at this through a bushfire initiative with the engineering people in Australia to operationalise this. And where I live in the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory, this is now starting to be rolled out. And in more recent times, with Dominick and Phil Zylstra and others, we've started to look at what happens when fire regimes are altered. The sequence of fires is changed, and think about the conservation of species that are sensitive to this, but also what happens to the condition in the ecosystem when fire regimes are changed, and what implications that has, not only for biodiversity, but also for extra fire occurring in the system. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm also going to leave an address for people to contact me if you want to follow up with papers or other material. I'm happy to do that. I do respond on email, usually pretty quickly, and I'm happy to send things out to people if they want to follow up. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and look forward to questions later.
Thank you, David. Our next speaker is Dr. Dominick DellaSala. Dominick is a Senior Conservation Science Associate at the Conservation Biology Institute and the former president of the Society for Conservation Biology North America section. He's an internationally renowned author of over 300 peer-reviewed papers and 9 award-winning books on forests, climate change, endangered species, and speaking truth to power. Dominick has given plenary and keynote talks at numerous academic conferences, the UN Earth Summit, and International Climate Change and Biodiversity Summits. He has appeared in National Geographic, Scientific American, Time Magazine, Audubon Magazine, the New York Times, LA Times, USA Today, CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and several PBS documentaries, and even Fox News. Dominick has served on several committees, including the White House Council Task Force on Forests and Oregon's Global Warming Commission Carbon Task Force, reporting to the governor. He is the editor of numerous scientific journals as well. Dominick is motivated by his work to leave a living planet for his 2 daughters, 4 grandkids, and all those who follow. Welcome, Dominick.
Thanks, Michelle, and good evening, everybody. On this, the eve of John Coltrane's birthday, famous jazz musician. I heard jazz earlier, so it reminded me of John Coltrane. I wanted to thank Conservation North for hosting this incredible webinar. I'm so honored to be on this panel with Herb and with my friend David LindenmAyer. And David has hosted me now in Australia at the Australia National University. So as a result of that, last year and in March of this year, we're rolling out these joint studies, which are really quite interesting because when you get biogeographical patterns that are consistent across large regions of the world that are not anywhere close in proximity, but are seeing similar patterns, that's a big deal in ecology. And so that's why you saw that Nature review paper and a lot of the other papers that are coming out in peer-reviewed journals that are challenging the notion of active management and in terms of its ecological impacts. Now, I want to say up front, and you'll see this later on, I'm not anti-active management, even though I've been accused of that. It's active management in the right places, the right times, and the right frequencies that you'll see at the very end slide that I definitely support. But what is not being documented sufficiently in a lot of these studies about the effects of thinning on fire intensity are the costs. There's a lot of information on the benefits, but not enough on the cost. And that's a paper that David and I and a bunch of other folks are working on right now. And this collaboration is taking place across major continents. We have representatives from Canada, Australia, Europe, and of course, Western United States working together on these biogeographical studies showing common trends and what's really driving these big, fast moving fires and these big insect outbreaks. So that's what I'm going to go through today in the time that I have. Whoops, I went too far. Sorry about that, folks. There we go. I got back to the beginning. All right, we'll leave it there. So I think to begin with, to address the key drivers of forest change, you have to start with a basic understanding of cause and effect relationships. Land management is mostly focused on the effect of changed fire and insect behavior and overlooks the underlying causes that are additive and interactive. If you just focus on the effect, then you've got the analogy that you see at the bottom of the screen there, the paper that I co-authored in 2022, which is land managers are acting as a mythological Sisyphus, trying to push this big, giant boulder up this increasing hill with Hades, climate change, bearing down on them and saying, you're not getting very far because you're not addressing the root causes. And so we've got to really take a look at root causes. And here's where the biogeographical patterns are very similar and very exciting in ecological circles to see this, that the increased fire causes are principally the result of extreme climate change that is amplified by extreme active management that is resulting in these fast, uncontrollable so-called mega fires. We're seeing this in those different continental forests that I mentioned. With respect to insect outbreak causes, particularly beetles in the Rocky Mountains around Colorado, extreme climate change is being amplified by extreme active management to increase the impact of those outbreaks that are cyclical and would work their way through the system if not for the interaction of climate change and extreme active management on the landscape. So if we just treat the effects and not the causes, we will fail. And that's the path that we are on now and what we discussed in the 2022 paper, and a paper that's coming out any day now in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences that deals with the dead tree issue, not responsible for fast fires that we're seeing today. So the Sisyphus analogy was published in the 22 study in biological conservation, and it basically looked at this pattern that you see here. The Forest Service and the U.S. Department of Interior through the Bureau of Land Management are spending billions of dollars on fire suppression that you see in those bar graphs at the bottom in different colors. And yet the line graph, area burned, is increasing almost at the same rate as the spending is. And so this kind of begs the question, are we really looking at the root causes here, or are we just treating the symptoms, the effects? And if that's the case, where we are arguing it indeed is, we are going to fail. The other issue that is overlooked is the over focus on the fuels with ignition blinders on. And what I mean by that is land managers are mostly looking at flammable vegetation, but they're not looking at anthropogenic fire ignitions, which is really the only factor on the landscape that can be controlled with any kind of measured success. And this graph here is from a paper that was in 2017 that shows the percent of human ignitions, with the darker red, orange colors being a higher number of ignitions in those particular areas that have the highest access to roads and especially lands where there are forests. So people get into those places, there are accidental and arson-related fires, and that's the road system. And we're not doing a good enough job of managing the road system, and consequently, a huge percentage of those wildfires across the continental United States are being caused by people. And people are contributing to longer wildfire seasons in the West. And it really is the only variable, a cause and effect relationship, that we have more control over. So we really have set up this imperfect storm of the interaction of climate change and out of control fires and increased insect outbreaks. There's history behind this, as well as contemporary logging and road building that targets the large trees and the primary forests that are the most fire resistant and resilient forests on the landscape. Right after World War II, or roughly during that time period, there was the militarization of fire suppression, mostly in the Western United States, with massive resources causing massive amounts of damage. You can get this in my paper in 2022, where we actually documented a lot of that damage. And a lot of fire suppression is necessary because the home's at the interface, but it comes with incredible costs. And that housing sprawl really started in the mid-century climatic cool down when it was a lot cooler conditions than it is now, creating a false sense of security that the Forest Service can put out every fire and the pressure to log. So this is the imperfect storm, where we've got human concerns intersecting with the wildlands, with the mismanagement of those systems, as David pointed out in his talk about the apocalypse of misinformation, with the focus on thinning and backcountry fuels treatments rather than the home itself as an ignition source. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about post-fire salvage logging and the misperception about dead trees as the fast fire problem. I mentioned that article is in press. We're hoping it comes out really soon. And then the overemphasis in the U.S. on public lands logging and protected areas being singled out, like roadless areas, as the fire problem, rather than the logged landscape, which is much higher a risk, as we're seeing now with the U.S. Trump administration rescinding the roadless rule and in efforts to get into roadless areas where they are not a high priority for fire risks. I did it again. All right. Here we go. Okay, so a lot of talk about beetle-killed areas which comes up a lot in the Rockies, both the U.S. and Canada, and in the inland forest of British Columbia. And we hear this notion that beetle-killed trees are a high risk of fire. And the evidence in multiple biogeographical studies shows that it's really the red and the gray needle phase, which is a short-lived phase when the trees are dying, that the crown fire risk is prevalent. But that drops precipitously when the needles fall off in a couple of years. So you've got no live crown to burn through the canopy. Now, intervention in the form of logging during that short-lived needle phase will degrade ecosystems and put all of that fuel, or most of it, especially the fine fuels, on the ground at the same time. And again, because of the studies that have been done biogeographical, the areas with the highest amount of insect kill are the ones that burn in the lowest severities once the needles drop. The snags in those forests don't contribute to fire spread. They can contribute to burn duration. But when you bring them down in a logging operation, now you've got the logging slash on the ground as the main fire spread problem, which is what firefighters are mostly concerned about. And importantly, the survivors of these insect infestations, the beetle infestations notably, hold important genetic adaptations. And that's some of the work that Diana Six has done in the Rockies, that those trees that have survived are the ones that can survive the next outbreak, but you can't see that when you're doing a logging operation. You take whatever is there. So logging really removed the checks and balances, the biological legacies in those forests that is habitat for a whole bunch of complex early cereal species, particularly insectivorous birds that can keep those insect outbreaks in relative check. All right, Michelle asked me to just kind of briefly note the importance of being primary in the primary forest compared to logged areas. I'm going to go through this quickly, but you can kind of get it from this slide. We published a paper, I think it was in 2020, on the importance of primary forests, and they are superior in every single measure of biodiversity that we can get on the ground and at the landscape level. Patch size and distribution, the presence of native species, particularly rare ones, keystone ecosystem processes, particularly carbon uptake and storage, hydrological processes, soil dynamics. The successional stages are all present in these forests. It's not just old growth. They can be any cereal stage compared to a managed landscape that has truncated cereal stages. The biological legacies are created by a stand replacing event that gives you a post-disturbance that could lifeboat that ecosystem through the various stages of forest succession, compared to logging that removes most of those legacies. Then you've got the invasive species problem, and you've got climate change adaptation potential, where you've got resistance and resilience more prevalent in primary forests that act as a climate refugia compared to the heat island effect of logged areas. A lot more of that is in my paper I mentioned that was published a few years ago. So the only problem, though, is primary forests are vanishing rapidly, and there's less than a third of the world's forests that are in this condition. And as you can see, Canada is up there in terms of having the most area, and it's mostly in the northern boreal and some in the BC rainforest, where you're getting these primary forests, and then they're scattered across the Canadian landscape. And then you can see further down there in the green where the US lies, and then all the other countries that follow. So these are really important, irreplaceable, one-of-a-kind forest systems. There are places where logging and fire suppression or fire thinning issues should not take place. This is a term that David and I coined in our 2025 paper, and I think it was in Biological Conservation. So when I was in grad school way back, we learned this textbook succession follows a linear progress. They go from pioneer to late old growth stages. But it really isn't like this. It's more of a circular successional process with all the development stages connected. And within a stand, if you have canopy gap dynamics where you've got a few of the big trees that have died from natural causes, then you've got the pioneering stage that's occurring in a competitive notion of trying to grab the light and the nutrient availabilities from canopy release inside an old growth stand. So these stands are dynamic. The successional processes are circular, they're not linear, and what we do to them can alter the trajectory in terms of the pathways and the timelines that they follow. And I want to call out specifically the importance of complex early cereal. We sort of coined this term in a paper published in 2013, and then subsequent papers and books on complex early cereal forest that are as biodiverse as old growth because of the presence of those biological legacies and the interconnected forest cereal stages in that circular pathway. So while primary forests are important, so are the subset of primary forest, the importance of being complex early cereal. And like I had comparisons with primary forest generally versus logged, you can see some of the differences between complex early cereal that are the result of a natural stand replacement event versus early cereal that's been triggered by a clear-cut logging operation. Every one of the factors that we look at, biological legacies, native understories, soil, carbon, landscape patterns, ecological integrity are superior in the complex early seral compared to the oversimplified early seral. And this was documented in a paper that I did in 2017. I hear a lot about this. I've testified in congressional hearings where protected forests, roadless areas, national parks are to blame for the big fires. And after I got off the congressional hearing, I actually worked with a number of scientists in testing that hypothesis. We assembled the largest data set ever on this question for all the Western states in the US. And what we came up with the opposite of misinformation. So the parks, the roadless areas, the protected areas were burning in lower severities that you see to the left on the graph, the cooler burning, so-called cooler burning fires. The multiple use lands where logging occurs and the private lands were burning in higher severities. This biogeographical pattern is consistent across large forested regions. You'll see it in the series of slides that follows, and David already presented it for his study plots in Australia. So we have landscapes like this that you can see the orange around a fire that burned through this area back in, I think it was 2013, the Douglas Fire Complex. And those clear cuts were actually the areas that burned in the highest fire intensities during extreme fire weather. And the older forest acted more as refugia. And this was repeated not only by our study, but by Zald and Dunn in 2018. So we saw a similar pattern in 2004. And then in another part of the bioregion, the Klamath-Siskiyou, where this took place, Zald and Den found a similar pattern with the most logged landscapes burning in the highest fire intensities. And David mentioned this paper that is in the final stages of review that I'm co-author on with Brendan Mackey, also from Australia. We took a look at Quebec, and a lot of the work that we did in Quebec was to first document where the remaining primary forests are, which there aren't many because you see on the slide on the right, most of that lighter area are clear cuts that have taken place in the Canadian Boreal in Quebec. Then we overlaid onto that landscape the burn severities, the darker red and orange colors being the higher fire intensities. And lo and behold, we found the same pattern that David found in Southeast Australia. The older forests burning in lower intensities, the clear cuts burning in higher intensities in extreme fire weather. And this pattern has been consistent across biogeographical realms. So this is a paper that David and I worked on, and David followed up on it in 2025. But we hear a lot about restoration. Is it restorative? Is it degradation? So we wanted to come up with a quantitative approach to assess whether active management is truly restorative or if it's degrading a system. So these are some graphics here that illustrate the approach. So the assumption here is we need a reference condition to compare an active management site to. On the left of that top horizontal bar that you see are the highest integrity sites, reference conditions like old growth, roadless areas. And then on the right are different stages of forest degradation based on their composite scores from a suite of principles, criteria, indicators, and verifiers that you see on the right. The table in our paper was so large I couldn't include it on the slide totally, but you kind of get the drift here about each one of these factors where there is good data can be scored on a relative basis along that composite score. And then you can plot this so-called spider graph, which has in the middle of it the highest scores, the reference areas, and then the active management areas, hypothetically, their scores and their departures from reference conditions. This is the process by which we are suggesting managers assess whether or not their approach to active management is restoration or degradation. Here are some examples that we cover in the paper. These are clear examples of places that have been degraded and that would score on the upper end of the degradation scale. Some examples. On the top left is an overventilated, overthinned forest, quote unquote, from the Santa Fe watershed, where blowdown is inevitable in that. And then in the middle, you've got a mistletoe restoration project that clear cut trees to get rid of mistletoe. And then you've got a weed infested, soil damaged area that is far from any kind of restoration. Then you've got ecosystems that go through cumulative impacts. You throw cows on them, you throw off-highway vehicles on them, and you exceed what David in his recent paper that we worked on talks about the disturbance burden, the cumulative effect of multiple disturbances. Post-fire logging, the lower left, is the worst that you can do to a forest that's going through its circular succession, and the road system is a major problem, as you can see. All of this is scaling up. In the US, the Trump administration has issued executive orders to log, is rescinding the roadless policy to go into the most fire adapted forests that we have there. And even before Trump, the Biden administration was throwing billions of dollars into subsidized logging to reduce fuels and then to burn the material as, quote, clean, renewable bioenergy. So it's not just Trump. I want to spend a brief point on roads because they are a major problem on amplifying chronic impacts. You can see the list of all these problems that happen when you punch roads in to a system that already is experiencing a disturbance burden. And so at the bottom of that slide is the difference between a pulse and a chronic disturbance. Pulse disturbances are natural events that result in circular succession. Chronic disturbances remain on the landscape, like roads, like clear cuts that are in rotation logging, that never really come back to their pre-disturbed condition. And that's a huge difference in the disturbance burden of ecosystems. Ecosystems are adapted to pulse disturbances. Ecosystems depart from their natural range of variation with chronic disturbances, which is the result of cumulative active management impacts. I want to spend a minute on active management in spotted owl habitat, which is in the Pacific Northwest. This notion that fuel management is necessary to reduce fire severity is completely ignoring the studies that have shown spotted owls are quite resilient to forest fires of mixed severities, and that actually will nest and forage in those areas. And yet we see thinning, we see post-fire logging, reducing canopies, leading to more habitat loss than the fires would. And the information that's being put out there, the misinformation, is that the science on owls and fire and thinning as remedial for fire is settled. And if you want to see the debate and the cross debate on this, you can query my name and look for the Manga Bay articles for the debate between myself and Paul Hesberg of the U.S. Forest Service. Okay, let's see. There we go. I mentioned post-fire logging. Here are some examples. This is absolutely destructive, degrading form of active management, particularly for indicator species like the blackback woodpecker that nests in these complex early cereal forests and lots of other species that use this habitat. This is the worst thing you can do to ecosystems that have experienced a stand replacing event. Briefly spend a few seconds on this active management thinning. David already covered a lot of this. You can lower fire intensity if you do everything right with thinning, but it's only under certain conditions, not under extreme fire weather, which is really what's happening now with climate change being the top-down driver of these big fire events. And to do everything right, you have to leave the large trees, you have to thin from below, and that's seldom done because of the commercial value. And then you can get into a debate about what is large. And you can see all the factors that you have to consider there. And even if you do everything right, you're going to probably be overrun by an extreme fire weather event. The odds of co-occurrence with fire on a thin site when the fuels are at the lowest are extremely low, so you have to scale up. And when you scale up, you're actually contributing to more emissions in the atmosphere, which feed back on future fires, causing more collateral damages than the fire intensity, high intensity fires that you're trying to prevent. And I did it again. There we go. We took a look at this question of where is the fuels reduction taking place. We looked at the northern Rockies of the U.S., the southern Rockies of the U.S., and now we're focused on the Pacific Northwest. And the bar graphs, I don't have enough time to go into them other than to tell you that from 2/3 to 3/4 of hundreds of agency fuel reduction projects are taking place more than a kilometer from the nearest structure. And we know from a number of published studies and experiments on houses, the most effective community wildfire risk reduction is to treat the structure itself. Yet most of the treatments are happening way beyond any structure and will have no effect on community survival. It's a zoning and a planning problem that has persisted for decades, and it's magnified by explosive growth in the interface, extreme fire weather, logging, roads, and all the active management cofactors. So I'm going to end with these two slides. The most effective way to avoid perpetuating the Sisyphus myth is to focus treatments on the causes and not just the effects. And that means curtailing emissions across all sectors, including forestry, which is a substantial source of emissions in the US and Canada and elsewhere. And that means protecting from logging, primary forest, high conservation value forests, roadless areas, large trees. Then you've got to deal with the ignition sources that we can control, which is the road system, deal with the vectors of weed spread, restore the missing pieces, the imperiled species, keystone species, and active management directed at the plantations. They need the treatment the most, not the older forest. And human communities are the biggest risk factors needing our support. Yeah, hang on. Sorry, folks. And a redirect of active management has continued here, and I'm not anti-active management. Stop causing more harm and remove the causal agents. That's passive restoration, and it's legitimate, and it needs to happen. Prescribed and cultural burning is important, but not pile or overburning. And I can take questions on that later. Working with fire for ecosystem benefits, all kinds of restoration that is legit, is active management that you can see there, and redirect the spending to home protection, defensible space. We have examples of dams coming out, which is restoring the traditional salmon runs and bringing back aquatic ecosystems where active management is doing a really good job. Okay, so I'm going to end on this because, as David mentioned, both of us rely heavily on peer-reviewed, evidence-based science. And even though there have been meta-analyses on the benefits of thinning, those studies, by and large, have ignored the significant degradation consequences and the cost of doing huge landscapes of all kinds of active management that you've seen there. And we've got to get to the root causes, as you've seen in the preceding slides, a proper cost-benefit analysis using the indicators that I presented between restoration versus degradation would get at whether or not you're doing the right thing. And then finally, we have to have some humility here. When I see scientists, especially from the Forest Service, making statements that the science is settled, which you will see in the Manga Bay articles, that really violates international calls for the precautionary principle and sustainable management. And we've got to be more precautionary with these ecosystems, otherwise we are at risk of hubris and causing irreparable damage. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to the facilitators. Thank you, and take questions later on.
Thank you, Dominick. We will now take a short 3-minute break, and then I will introduce our next speaker, who is Herb Hammond. Thank you, everyone. We'll be right back in 3 minutes. Our next speaker tonight is Herb Hammond. Herb Hammond is a forest ecologist and retired registered professional forester with more than 45 years of experience in research, industry, teaching, and consulting. He is best known for his concept and application of nature-directed stewardship, the protection and ecologically responsible use of ecosystems through all scales of time and space. This goal is achieved through identification and establishment of networks of ecological reserves at multiple spatial scales. Working primarily with Indigenous nations and other rural communities, Hammond has developed more than 25 nature-based plans across Canada and in other parts of the world. Herb holds a Bachelor of Science in Forest Science from Oregon State University and a Master's of Forestry and Forest Ecology and Silviculture from the University of Washington. He is the author of Seeing the Forest Among the Trees, The Case for Holistic Forest Use, which won the Roderick Hay Brown BC Book Prize in 1992, and Maintaining Whole Systems on Earth's Crown, Ecosystem-Based Conservation Planning for the Boreal Forest. Along with 2 other authors, he recently released Nature First Cities, Restoring Relationships with Ecosystems and with Each Other, put out by UBC Press. The book focuses on applying nature-directed stewardship to restore urban areas. Herb is also working on a book about nature and our place in her complex fabric. This book draws on Indigenous knowledge and ways of being shared with him by many Indigenous people through the years. With assistance from Indigenous collaborators, Herb hopes to describe a new reality for settler cultures, a reality that is necessary for our survival, and how to get there in the face of the biodiversity and climate crises. Welcome, Herb.
Thanks, Conservation North, for putting this on. It's an honor to be here with David and Dominick, whose work I have used and admired for many years. Let me start by saying that I'm coming to you from the unceded territories of the Sinixt, the Syilx, and the Ktunaxa nations. My home in settler terms is the Slocan Valley in southeastern British Columbia. So I want, through this presentation, to add to what David and Dominick have said so well tonight, that to look at the effects on ecosystem integrity and biodiversity through active management as it is currently practiced in British Columbia. Okay, let's see here. For some reason, let's try this. Okay. So just to kind of frame this in the from an ecological standpoint and primary forests, if we think about intact primary forests and their natural character, they're the best at water conservation. They have some of the highest levels of carbon sequestration and storage, and they have the highest levels of biodiversity. Indeed, their positioning across forest landscapes uses the biodiversity to regulate the natural disturbance regimes and keep the system in a dynamic balance. I want to also remind us here about the importance of water. Water is a huge issue and a growing issue with climate change. So primary forests do that really well. And if we think about how they do it, we can start with the fact that they intercept large amounts of water from transpiration, from photosynthesis, and they gather and store that water in the ecosystem. Then they move it. They move it within small patches, but they also move it across landscapes. Headland forests the water that they intercept moves across continents. So they play an extremely valuable role in that movement. And eventually they release the water through multiple processes of drip through the tree crowns and lower plants. That drip is important because it doesn't overload the system with water as if the forest was not there. And eventually, a lot of that water finds its way into the soil, the groundwater, and streams. Some research indicates that surface runoff in natural undeveloped watersheds is less than 1% of the precipitation falling on the watershed. So that cycle of water from primary forests plays very important stand and landscape functions. Now I want to briefly set the stage here for what's happening in British Columbia. If we think about what the government says about what we're doing, it uses science-based processes. It sets allowable annual cuts based on those science-based processes, and it manages for biodiversity. Keep that in your mind as we look at how active management is practiced across British Columbia. The professional foresters or forest professionals of British Columbia operate under a code, an ethical code that subscribes to those purposes that I just showed you about British Columbia. And so there I've emphasized again that it's the way foresters behave or allegedly behave in British Columbia is based on the application of an ecological understanding across scales in forests. And that's there to protect ecosystem function, integrity, and resilience. So once again, keep that in mind as we take a look at what's going on here. Some key ecological understandings that need to be embedded in forestry that protects integrity and biodiversity is to remember that composition and structure determine function. So if you change the composition or the structure, you're going to change the function. And that needs to be thought about before, not after, prescribing active management or any other form of forest management. The other thing that is going on here is we're misrepresenting what's happening with forestry. We talk about reforestation. Well, reforestation is planting trees, and it's true that we can plant trees successfully, but you can't plant a forest. And that gives the public a misrepresentation of what we're actually doing there. Forests are built on dead trees. Continuous clear-cut plantation forestry doesn't provide for dead trees in the future because they're continuous short cycles of logging, planting, which robs the system of the biological legacies of fallen trees or dead trees in that system. So this active management approach actually leads to these problems, in my opinion. They lead to clear-cut plantation forestry approach across landscapes. So let me talk about some examples of that are occurring now of active management across British Columbia. The probably most obvious one and most common one is clear-cut plantation forestry. It dominates forest management across BC. That approach it results in what has been termed irrecoverable carbon. And by cutting those trees, removing them from the site, turning them into various forms of wood products from paper and paper products, even to house parts, 2x4s, structural lumber, means that something in the order of 65 to 75% of the carbon in those trees is back in the atmosphere within 5 years. And that becomes a part of the irrecoverable carbon that can't be recaptured through forest regrowth, carbon sequestration, and storage in the time left before we have critical or the worst impacts of global warming. There's been a lot of studies done here and elsewhere, not only in BC, but in Oregon, for example. There have been studies that show that timber harvesting is by far the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. So something's wrong with that kind of active management. We need to deal with carbon and its influence as a cause, not just an effect, but as a cause of forest degradation. So here's a couple of pictures about the long-lasting impacts that come from active management with clear cuts and plantations. They're a carbon dead zone for somewhere in the order of 5 to 15 years following the clear cut. They actually emit carbon for a period of that time. They have a large loss of biological diversity and resilience as the system has changed from a heterogeneous system to a homogeneous kind of composition and structure. And as has been pointed out, they have the highest fire risk. So you're going from primary forests that have the lowest fire risk to a plantation forest that has the highest fire risk. And because of the lack of large old trees and multi-layered canopies, they also demonstrate a loss of carbon sequestration and storage. These impacts are being exacerbated with climate change as it progresses. We know that if we continue along the path that we're on with climate change, we're going to reach a point where these composition and structure of these kinds of forests will be replaced by a new regime, a new ecological regime. And that because of the fact that that new regime comes from such an oversimplified forest, if I can call it that, or a plantation, those new regimes will lack diversity and resilience going into the future. Much better to face climate change with primary forests that have high levels of biodiversity and resilience. That would whatever climate change deals us, those new regimes will be more resilient and more stable than those that come from tree plantations. So if we think a little bit more about some of the impacts of clear cuts and tree plantations, there has been a lot of work done recently by Jonas Alila and his associates at UBC on water and flood risk, that as well as drought risk that comes from large-scale clear cutting and wildfires. This is a quote from one of his papers that I'll let you ponder over a little bit here. But certainly what Jonas is trying to tell us is that water needs to come to the top when it comes to setting the kind of forest policies that are based on science and maintain ecological integrity and biodiversity across scales of space and time in the forest landscapes. His work and others indicate that we're talking about 30% or more. Sometimes I've seen numbers as high as 50 and 60% of the precipitation that falling on natural or old forests is evaporated and sublimated or sublimated and moved across the landscape. That's back to what I mentioned about water interception and how forests, intact primary forests, move water across the landscape. But if you're talking about clear cutting and young plantations, they collect that 30% plus snowpack. It melts and melts faster in the clear cuts than under the forest, and it's responsible for floods. And ultimately, because the timing of water release is all at once in the spring, it's also responsible for fall droughts. So, and another reminder here that these are also not only problematic for water and water distribution, but they're also the most flammable, as you can see from the debris on the ground in this forest. So let's move now to talking a little bit about salvage logging, or what is more correctly described as post-disturbance logging. This is a large area of post-disturbance logging after fire in northern BC. So if we look more closely at that, we can see there are a number of impacts. Increased roads, which are not only taking productive soil out away from forests but also slowing the recovery of ecological integrity and biological diversity by removing the dead stems. It's interesting to me that when a fire burns through an area like that, the most of the carbon stored in the above ground trees is intact in those standing dead trees or snags. It's a good reason to leave them as carbon stores, not truck them away and make them into short-lived wood products. This also degrades the hydrological function, whether you're talking about, like is shown in this picture, a relatively flat area or sloped areas, because those roads intercept and redirect water. They take water away from being well distributed across a forest area. And the other thing that happens in these areas is not just roads that you can, like you see in that picture, but throughout that logged area, there will have been ground-based skidders and machinery that compacts the soil and prevents natural water movement, infiltration and movement. And as I mentioned, there's a loss of carbon sequestration and storage that is a very significant amount in the large trees, because they represent somewhere over 90% of the above ground carbon that was present in that forest. So if we now move to thinking about active management as wildfire risk reduction, thinning. This has become a really popular treatment that's funded through a subsidy. The Forest Enhancement Society of British Columbia, which is a government agency that promotes and funds these activities. This is an example in northern BC of fire risk mitigation projects, and demonstrates how widely scattered they are across the province. So if we talk again about impacts of thinning for wildfire risk reduction, there's a big potential when you thin these stands to actually increase the fire risk, because you dry out, you have a lower humidity in the forest itself, you dry out the soil and the fine fuels that exist under the canopy. Also, there's a tendency, because they're oftentimes attractive to timber interests, to remove fire-resistant trees. In the area where I live, those trees would include things like Douglas fir and western larch, ponderosa pine, and that's also increasing the fire risk, not reducing it through the treatment. And there's the always present with these kinds of active management approaches, loss of biodiversity and ecological integrity, as well as a loss of carbon sequestration and storage. There is quite a perverse scheme right now of pellet production from primary forests and the thinnings that allegedly reduce wildfire risk. If you look at that picture in the center, and you think about that as an area in the West Kootenay where I live that was thinned and piled and burned. Those piles, when they're burned, literally sterilize the soil underneath them and around them. And so if you imagine them scattered over 10 to 20% of those thin landscapes, you're not only creating a situation that is not very, is still going to be very risky for fire, but you're also causing permanent damage to the soils. The pellet scam that I mentioned is that the idea is, well, we can pull material to the roadside in these thinnings rather than piling and burning it, and chip it and compress it into wood pellets, which are then transferred largely to across the ocean to the UK, Korea, Japan, to be burned for electricity. And if we think about the impacts of that pellet production and thinning, there is again that ever-present loss of biodiversity and ecological integrity, loss of carbon sequestration and storage from the stand that's thinned. And there's also a carbon debt that's created by converting standard forests or standing forests to biofuels. That's very closely akin to irrecoverable carbon. And especially when we know that when those pellets are burned, the greenhouse gas production is 2 to 3 times the greenhouse gas from burning fossil fuels for energy, then the carbon debt is magnified. So this is a really I would call it more disinformation than even misinformation of how to manage carbon in forest ecosystems. Another approach to active management is the use of pesticides, and they target non-timber species. They're not really a necessary activity. Their impacts include loss of biodiversity and ecological integrity, which you now see as a familiar theme, loss of carbon sequestration and storage, increased fire risk by favoring conifers over mixed conifer deciduous forests, a loss of structural diversity, which is important for a lot of animals to thrive in these systems. These are two paired pictures of what happens when you use herbicides to treat a biologically rich site. This is after a clear cut and before aerial spraying with herbicide. And then what I refer to here as a silent spring in the same clear cut, a biologically rich site after spraying with herbicides. So now I want to quickly just present a different approach than active management, what I refer to as a nature-directed stewardship. So it follows a path that's regenerative, respectful, gratitude-filled, and reciprocal relationship with nature. That's those four principles are the underpinnings of nature-directed stewardship. And Jeanette Armstrong, who's a Silk elder and wise person, reminds us that ethical conduct within nature is based on reciprocity. There are a few key principles to nature-directed stewardship. First, focus on what to protect, then on what to use. What to protect are intact, fully functioning ecosystems from the scale of this darning needle on a bluebell to whole watersheds, whole landscapes. The nature-directed stewardship is built on an application of the precautionary principle that I refer to as ecological limits. Respecting those ecological limits is a key way to take precautionary activity or to carry out precautionary activities. Some examples of ecological limits include shallow soils, very dry or very wet sites, steep, broken, unstable slopes, snow-dominated ecosystems, upper elevations where trees have a really tough time growing given climate limitations, unique and rare habitat, threatened and endangered species, riparian ecosystems are the lifeblood that flows through an ecosystem, and old natural forests, which we've been hitting upon many times tonight, are key to protecting. In fact, given the spread of active management and industrial forest management across the landscape, natural intact ecosystems also need to be seen as ecological limits. And the priorities of nature-directed stewardship are achieved through establishment of ecological reserves and, where indigenous nations want that, cultural reserves at multiple spatial scales. Here's an example from a plan that we did for the Innu Nation for a large landscape that actually worked from establishing large protected areas and linkages all the way down to individual areas where it was judged appropriate to carry out timber management. And primary forests large areas of primary forests are protected at the large landscape and small landscape scales. Secondary or restoration forests are then restored or managed under nature-directed plans at the watershed level, and finally at the site or stand level. That there's a lot to be said about that diagram, but I think the concept is clear there of the multiple spatial scale reserve designs. So we're increasingly faced, though, with ecological restoration. And ecological restoration is a place where appropriate active management designed and carried out in precautionary ways will work. The first priority, though, with restoration is stop making the mistakes that create the need for restoration. A lot of those mistakes are found in the way active management is carried out. And then ecological restoration doesn't mean you can have a quick fix. It's a way to assist natural processes to reestablish natural ecosystem composition, structure, and function. Here's just a few examples. I've worked for almost 40 years with the Haklip Nation, and a good share of that time I've helped them develop a system that we call ecocultural restoration. This is an example of restoration of dry Douglas fir. This stand is part of Haklip territory where colonial governments eliminated indigenous management systems that resulted in these in very dry, overstocked Douglas fir forests. So this photo shows thinning and lopping and scattering the thinnings and the prunings in the stand. That removes the fire ladders and small trees. The pruning to 3 to 4 meters helps prevent lifting a fire if one were to start within that area and into the crowns of the trees. And it also, from a standpoint of forestry, it provides more growing space for these trees in a very dry environment, so that the key ingredient in increasing that growing space is providing adequate water for the trees to be maintained on the site. I mentioned lopping and scattering the slice. That definitely is important to keep as many of the nutrients on the site as possible. There are some challenges here. Douglas fir bark beetle concerns, which I'll show you another slide here in a moment. Hopefully, Haklip hopes, given climate change and what happens in the future, to reintroduce ground fire on 10 to 15 year cycles in the future, which was a key part of their traditional management. This is an example of some of the thin trees that we wanted to leave on the ground to decay and become water storage and filtration systems in this dry area. So you can see the boring frass here from Douglas fir bark beetle, which once a tree is on the ground in a warm position, the beetles flock to those trees and reproduce. So we've found a solution to that. We want to keep as many of those trees on the ground as possible, but we take a portion of them and deck them as logs in the fall and winter to attract beetles in the spring. And in the spring, we can then cut up those logs for firewood, distribute it to the elders by removing them from the restoration area, and we've solved the beetle issue. This ecocultural restoration is also about restoring food and medicine plants, like this example of Sapertia canadensis, or in the Stockholm language, Hosham, which is an important food and medicine plant. It had been overtopped in these dry forests and had, which was once a common plant, had become quite scarce. And that they serve as an anchor around which we open up the forest to provide the right habitat for these plants. On Galliano Island, we've actually restored a 30-year-old plantation of Douglas fir. And we've done that in a place where the original forest was windrowed, with all the big trees pushed into piles. And when we talk about appropriate ways for restoration to happen with active management, we took those piles apart and redistributed those big fallen trees, which you see in the picture there, which are really important for water and nutrients, and particularly storehouses for water and nutrients to be distributed across the site. Important too, this site had already had enough soil damage, so all of that movement of these big trees was done by hand with block and tackle that we set up in different points, lifted these big trees up and moved them so they were distributed across the site. So let me just conclude by a few words here. Buckminster Fuller had a really nice way of saying it. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. I think that's what we're all working on here tonight. And it's important to remember we are part of nature. And when we approach what to do there, we need to think like an intact ecosystem. And finally, we need to remember that there are some kind of foolish notions out there about what needs to be done. We can make much better choices if we think carefully and connect our hearts to our brains. So finally, let's remember that we aren't the originator of things here. We inhabit a landscape of gifts peopled by non-human relatives, the sovereign beings who sustain us. That's a wonderful statement from Robin Wall Kimmerer. And that does it for me tonight. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Herb. My name's Kate. I am a biologist and I'm a volunteer with Conservation North, and I'm going to moderate the question period tonight. I'm going to start with some questions for David, just because that's where we started our presentations tonight. So, David, I'm going to start with this one. Somebody asks from the chat, in the regrowth with increased flammability from your talk, is the regrowth natural composition or replanted?
It's regrowth that's it's not replanted, it's reseeded. So what happens is that seeds are collected from the canopies of trees before harvesting, and that seed is stored, and then after the site is clear cut and the logging slash is burnt, then a helicopter flies over the top and reseeds the dominant eucalypts in the system, and then it regrows. So that's the silviculture for that kind of tall wet forest. The density of the stand is much higher than it would be under a natural fire regime.
Okay, thank you. Dom, did you want to jump in there, or are you happy? No, okay. Okay, I'm going to give you one more, David, before we send one out to the panel. one of the first questions was around human traffic damaging soils and soil moisture, and wondering whether humans and vehicles should remain out of native or undisturbed forest areas, and will forest health and soil healing spread around these areas if they are left alone?
Okay, so what we see is that on average, a wood production area in Australia has about 30% of its area with compacted soils and impaired tree growth. And that includes snick tracks, log landings, minor roads, and larger roads. So it's about 30% less tree cover and reduced tree growth relative to what you would have in an intact system. We see that the effect on soils in terms of soil nutrients, soil structure, sand fraction, those kinds of things, those effects last for about 80 years after logging or logging and fire and salvage logging. So the effects are prolonged and they're very substantial and they're very widespread. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. This is a question for David and Dominick. Can you discuss what we should be doing with all the secondary forest? What would be the most effective active management action we could take in secondary forests moving forward?
In an Australian context, the most effective active management is to leave them alone. And the second thing to do for us is to control feral animals. So we have major problems with feral cats, feral foxes, feral deer, and in some cases, weed invasions. So there are those kinds of activities that are going to likely to be important. Feral deer in Australia are a huge issue, and they impair natural regeneration because they target particular plant species that are very, very tasty to eat after they've germinated following a major fire. So for us, the thing that's really missing from our ecosystems now is old growth forest. We've lost about 77% of our old growth in the state of Victoria in the last 25 years. And what's happening is that the more the forest is logged, the more flammable it gets, the more likely it reburns, the more likely those fires spread out beyond the direct area that's been logged. And that means that it burns more substantially across the landscape, which regenerates younger forest, which is flammable, which is more likely to reburn. So it's what we call a landscape trap. So the key issue for us, I think, is try to have more of the regrowth forest set aside to eventually become old growth, and also to embrace feral animal control, and also to embrace new technologies to see if we can extinguish some of these fires when it's more straightforward to do so, which is when they're small. And we have some differences compared to parts of North America where there's a fire deficit. We are in major fire surplus in Australia at unprecedented levels.
Yeah, I could jump in on that.
Yeah.
I think, from my perspective, it depends on biogeography, what the objectives are, and the fact that we are going to use wood in society. So you got to kind of take more of a gestalt look at this. So biogeographically, if I'm in Europe and I'm dealing with like temperate rainforest in the UK, there's so little primary left. So semi-natural forest is what we refer to in the European context, which are second growth and multiple growth. They've gone through coppice logging for centuries. Those with high biodiversity that have a high lichen ecology that makes them temperate rainforest, even though they're sessile oak woodlands, those need to be part of the restoration objective of the UK, and that's happening in a lot of places. Now, if we move over to, let's say, the US and Canada, the second growth, if it is a stand replacing event like a insect infestation or a severe fire that's gone through a primary forest that is now in the pioneering stages, obviously, that's as important as an old growth primary forest. The places where we get our wood products is the existing footprint, and it should not be in primary forests. What we try to do in Alaska was under the Obama administration was to move logging out of old growth forests and into recovering clear cuts that had self-seeded and were anywhere from 45 to 60 years old that could supply the timber needs on a smaller logging footprint than taking out old growth and going into roadless areas. Now, of course, that's been reversed twice now by Trump, first term, second term, restored by Biden when he was in there. But that's the direction that we need to be going. If you look at my image, you'll see guitars on my wall, so I use wood. I got a book canister there too. I use wood. And we don't need to be making those materials out of old growth. There are all kinds of alternative materials that can be used to supply wood fiber needs. We've got to basically get our consumption footprint down and how we're eating our way across the planet's remaining natural forests. And where we do get our wood fiber needs to be in the existing footprint and not expanding out into the primary forest. I want to say one other thing real quickly. The kind of active management that we've been talking about today spans a gradient of active management. It's not just clear-cut logging. It's commercial removal of fire-resistant trees. You could still have a forest there, but when you commercially extract the upper canopy and you're impacting the soils, you're going to have an impact. And the same with post-fire logging. So and post-fire logging is analogous to a clear cut. It's just after a burn or a stand replacing event. So the degree of impacts and degradation will depend on frequency, intensity, and how much material is removed. This is the so-called disturbance burden that David led in the paper in 2025. So the more you push these ecosystems, clear cutting will be on the far end of the degradation gradient. The more they're going to flip to a different dynamic, and they're not going to come back the way that's going to continue to provide us with this broad suite of ecosystem benefits that we get from intact forests, from primary forest, from high conservation value forest. So the more we take out of the forest, the bigger our footprint.
Okay, thanks, Dominick and David. I have one for David, and then I have one for the whole panel. David, somebody is wondering what kind of cultural burning was actually carried out by Aboriginal peoples in Australia pre-contact.
Okay, so pre-contact, we need to remember that there was 350 different nations across Australia, and each nation burnt country in different ways for different reasons. Men and women burnt country for different reasons. And so I think it's really crucial to understand that. The other major issue here is that there were three kinds of fire. The first one was pathway burning, where people burnt very, very narrow paths through the environment as a movement pathway. And that was important in Australian context because pre-colonisation, Australia had very large populations of small mammals, and they were burrowing and digging in lots of places. And where you have lots of small mammals, you have lots of things that like to eat them. And in an Australian context, if you stand on some of those things, they will kill you. We have the most venomous snakes in the world. And so Aboriginal people were smart about this, and they didn't want to walk on those things. So they burnt pathways, and they were often only a table or 2 tables wide in width. It's the first type of fire. Second type of fire was women's fire that was burning relatively small areas to produce tubers and other food crops. And they were quite constrained, only a handful of hectares in each case. And then there was men's fire, which was to create green pick for animals to hunt. Okay, and the key thing is that you don't want to burn over large areas. If you're smart and you live in a country for 70,000 years, you don't want to spend extra energy trying to hunt animals over vast distances because you've burnt massive amounts of country. You burn small areas, to bring the animals to you rather than have them all over the country. And so the burning was actually very specific for particular reasons and very confined, spatially confined for those reasons. So there were large parts of Australia's estate that actually weren't burnt or didn't burn very frequently. And so the cultural burning side of things is really important because these tend to be very low intensity burns over very small areas. We've been working with First Nations people on this. And there were large parts of the landscape that weren't burnt, but as a result of that, actually made their way to that much lower flammability state that we talked about in the early stage. The big problem that has occurred is that Australia's forestry agencies and our fire agencies have misinterpreted this and are applying industrial scale hazard reduction burns over vast areas at very high severity, which is massively damaging some of our ecosystems and actually shifting some of them into a more flammable state than they were before. So in some ways, this is a corruption of early Aboriginal knowledge for purposes that cultural burning was not used for. Australian Aboriginal people did not use cultural burning for asset protection. That's really important to understand that. So the concept's been commandeered and misapplied in many cases. And I think that's really, really important to understand. It takes a lot of work to do a cultural burn. You might burn an area that might be 20 or 30 hectares in a 2-week period. So you're not going to be burning vast parts of the country that way. Remembering that Australia's total population of Aboriginal people pre-colonisation was probably less than 500,000. Okay, so a lot of the populist literature that is written about large-scale fire in Australia is what we call bullshit in Australia. It has no scientific basis whatsoever, and it's actually highly detrimental to the way that First Nations people actually related to country. And it's cultural misappropriation. And I think it's really important that we understand this, because Australia is sometimes held out as a model for every other country to burn every square inch of their landscape every second Tuesday. Don't make that mistake, because it's not right. I rest my case. Get off my soapbox.
Thank you, David. That was explicitly clear. I appreciate that. Okay, this is for the whole panel, and maybe we'll start with Herb because he's in BC. Can you talk about specifically, maybe in your area or broadly, if you prefer, how governments and industry use fear to manipulate the public on active management? So saying things like, well, the Jasper fire wouldn't have been nearly as bad had we only thinned the fire or the forest surrounding the town, things like that. Herb, do you want to go ahead first?
Sure. Well, I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the main reasons is to distract people from thinking about what really needs to be done to deal with the climate change and biodiversity crises. They're purporting the kind of active management that we talked about as ways to fix those crises. And if people don't dig into that a little bit, or in a lot of ways trust their common sense, then they kind of defer to what they refer or think about as the experts on that. I also think that the kinds of disasters, natural disasters that happened in Jasper and in Lytton, for example, in British Columbia, are things that terrify a lot of people living in the interior and the drier mid-range to dry forest landscapes. So they have an audience that's grasping for some kind of a solution, and if that's passed out by government and forest management, it's oftentimes not questioned. It's just so I think that fear factor is a very real one that hides a lot of what's actually going on.
Yeah, I could jump in on that because I lost half of my town in the Labor Day fires of 2020. The Alameda fire in Southern Oregon took out almost 3,000 structures right in my backyard. And I had been arguing with decision makers and groups like the Nature Conservancy that logging in the backcountry would not save communities. It's the wrong approach. And what happened was climate change really triggered those fires, and that's now been published in a number of papers where the vapor pressure deficit was at an all-time low, meaning a big drought was in the area, and a heat dome was camped over us. High winds, and that's the recipe for just blowing right through everything. And it went structure to structure, and homes fell down like dominoes right in my backyard. And yet millions of dollars being spent in the backcountry, including going into late successional reserves, roadless areas, national monuments that have been proposed. Those are the wrong places to be taking trees out, especially when towns are burning down. And I just want to underscore the importance of primary forests. There is no need to take any trees out of a primary forest, live or dead. Those trees are essential to the ecology of those forests. And taking those trees out, whether you're in a primary or a secondary forest, is not going to help communities get through an increasing threat of fast-moving fires that are spreading as a result of the interaction of climate change and heavily logged and roaded landscapes, like you've been hearing from the presentation today.
Thanks, Dom. Did you want to speak to that one at all, David?
Yeah, in our case, we have the normal knee-jerk reaction. We have to do something. We have to do something. And the reality is that under catastrophic fire conditions, there's often very little you can do. So now we have strategies in some states where there's an evacuation of an area because it's not possible to fight some of these fires under such extreme conditions. I would say in an Australian context, for southeastern Australia, areas that have had a long history of repeated logging will burn at much, much higher severity, even under moderate conditions, relative to intact country burning under extreme conditions. And so that highlights the value of these intact areas of forest. And so really we're living with the consequence of large-scale industrial forestry that has changed the flammability of the forest. There's no doubt about that. And so that really pushes us towards being very careful not to add to even more flammability across these landscapes than we already have. It also means that the best time to tackle a fire is when it's small. And that's where you can use new technology. For God's sake, if we can kill Ukrainians and Russians sitting under a bush in that part of Europe with drone technology, we can use the same technology to save people and people's houses by extinguishing fires when they're small. That's a really big issue. And in Australia, we've had some circumstances where a fire has occurred on a Wednesday or a Thursday, but fire agencies don't want to tackle a fire until a Saturday or a Sunday because they get higher rates of pay on those holidays. I'm quite serious about that. And I think there is a role for technology to help us. It doesn't replace humans in firefighting, absolutely not, but it does help. And it means that if you can extinguish these small fires quickly, you can save your workforce for when you've got really major fires. And that's a really important bonus for people's health. The fewer fires that they have to fight, the less smoke that they have to breathe, the longer people are going to live. And I think that's an important aspect of this. The other thing that I think is missing in the discussion is cost-effective analysis. Like, how cost-effective is it to go to incredibly remote areas and light massive burns and do huge amounts of thinning. I would suggest that it's not cost effective at all relative to its ecological effectiveness. So we actually need to rethink what we're doing here. If you've got $200-300 million to spend on fire, do you go to the most remote parts of BC or the most remote parts of Alberta or Saskatchewan and work there? Absolutely not. We need to rethink how you spend precious taxpayer dollars to give you the best return on investment, and that is not happening at the moment. And as Dominick said earlier, we're not actually thinking about the disbenefits, the disadvantages that go with some of these components of active management that undermine the integrity of some of the systems. We actually need to be functional if we're going to tackle climate change and other issues.
I would just
Okay.
support
Yeah.
what David just said, with the exception of Western North America, which he pointed out earlier, is in a fire deficit. So what we want to do is look for the conditions where we can work with natural fires for ecosystem benefits. And the amount of suppression that has happened in the Western US and Canada has contributed to some of these problems. And so clearly, if a fire is barreling down on a community, we want to hit that with everything we can. But we also want to look for those opportunities, which is becoming a shrinking window of where we can work with fire under safe conditions. And the same goes with prescribed burning. We're seeing all kinds of a narrowing window of using that because of climate change. And so in some cases, these prescribed burns escape and they cause a lot of damage. And the issue is, while that's important to use that as a tool, it doesn't solve for the root causes, which are only getting worse.
Okay. Thanks, Dominick. I'm going to ask this one. This one has been directed at both David and Dominick. I want to ask it because there have been multiple iterations of this kind of question throughout the question box. And essentially it's asking, do you think that some type of logging, whether it's thinning or gap-based logging or that plus silviculture in an old growth forest, can still maintain some kind of reasonable facsimile of primary forest composition, structure, and function? And I feel like I already know what you're going to say, but I'm going to let you address that because it has been asked multiple times.
Now,
I would actually maybe
stay
all
out
three
of
of
those
you.
areas. They are lowest priority. We don't need to be tinkering in those places. For example, the Pacific Northwest, the Forest Service's own studies, they've published this in 2 papers monitoring fire intensity levels in old forest and spotted owl habitat. In those systems, fire is burning in lower intensities. Why the heck do you need to go into those places? There are so many higher priorities. The roaded, logged areas are the places that are burning in the most uncharacteristic ways and that are spilling over, by the way, into the wildland urban interface. That study was published by Oregon State University a few years ago. The spillover effect that is impacting a lot of communities is not coming from public lands all the time. It's mostly coming from private lands, where, as we've pointed out in our presentations, the heavier the logging footprint, the more intense burning you're going to get. So why go into the old forest when you've got so many priorities out of the areas that we've already degraded?
I would agree with that entirely. I think in an Australian context, we've had forests here for 180 million years. And that means that we've had nobody screwing with them for 179,930,000 years. And they've managed to survive quite well, thank you very much, without us messing with them. So I think we have to have significant areas where we don't mess with forests for a whole range of reasons, but because they can do this stuff on their own without humans playing God. And I think, every time that we try to intervene because we think we're going to make it better, it often has a perverse outcome that makes it worse. And what's missing now in large parts of many landscapes around the world is the really old forests, because we've liquidated them. That was a policy in Australia dating back to the 1920s. get rid of old forests because they're full of horrible old bent trees with hollows and things, replace them with regrowth. And now we've got this legacy, this fire legacy that we didn't realize we were going to have until just about 10 years ago. And I don't want to see that problem perpetuated for another 70 years. We're starting to learn these things now. Let's actually take some notice of it, and let's re-embrace the notion of evidence and science. And despite what's happening over the border.
And just one other modification of my remarks, I will say that in the right forest types, in the dry systems, cultural burning practices, medicinal plants management, that's all a type of active management that would be consistent with ecological integrity and sustained by cultural burning practices through millennia. So in those dry forest types, that kind of active management indeed would be compatible with the ecological conditions under which those forests evolved and are adapted to.
Well, one thing that I would add about what we might call light touch forestry in old growth or primary forests, and whether or not it does any kind of irrevocable damage to those forests. We need to start with the fact that we don't even know how those forests function. But we don't know what we're degrading when we start thinning or doing light touch forestry there. And as Dom and David have pointed out, there's so few of them left that it doesn't make any sense. But we need to have the humility to realize that we don't understand how they work. And so we're potentially destroying biodiversity that we know nothing about.
Okay,
My father had a
you.
term for this, at the risk of being very Australian and risque. He called this, we want to avoid being victims of immaculate self-deception. And we want to avoid thinking that we know everything about systems and we know it so well that we have the arrogance that we think that we can manage these things like this. We have to have areas where we don't mess with them as controls, as comparators, and places where we don't play God. I think that's really important. And we've missed that. We think we have to manage everywhere all the time, whether it's burning or thinning or putting in roads. Remembering that, as Dominick's indicated quite eloquently, that a lot of ignitions take place by humans around roads.
Check out the Manga Bay articles, because it's the debate between Hesberg and myself and what I think is pure hubris, that we think that we can play God with these ecosystems like the science is settled, when in fact that a lot of blindfolds are on in terms of what the impacts are.
Okay, I think we're going to maybe have David saying printed on t-shirts for all the website attendees or something, or the webinar attendees. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think we'll wrap it up for tonight. And I'll just mention that we will get as many of your questions answered as we can by our panel of experts. Just maybe we'll ask them to email us a few answers, and we will get them to you. We'll post them or email them to you, because there were over 50 questions asked, and which is amazing, and we'll do what we can to get them answered. So I think this is kind of a natural follow-up to the questions that you've just answered. So then, given kind of what you've said, is zonation then, a system of zonation, a useful way to address this situation where primary forests are entirely taken out of production, and then restoration efforts are protected from future forestry rotations, and then extraction is kind of focused on another land base or a smaller land base?
Well, I started my career in the 1980s riding the wave of the new science of conservation biology. And one of the first books that I read was Larry Harris's book, The Fragmented Forest. And he talks about this in the early 1990s, the zonation issue, as a way to reduce the level of the humanity's ecological footprint on nature. And you can kind of see that we're failing at that experiment. Get on a Google image, check out the BC park system, look outside the park system, how different the conditions are. Look at the western line between Yellowstone National Park and the Targhee National Forest. There's no buffer there. Bison come out of the park, they get shot. Wolves, bears come out of the park, they get shot. So, yeah, in theory, this is definitely a way to reduce the spillover impacts into protected areas and allow more of nature to exist in a sea of humanity. But in practice, it seldom occurs. And that kind of buffering effect, the zonation effect that Herb showed in his presentation, is a good way to go. And I wish we could do more of it in practice, particularly by sprinkling in more restoration. And that means closing and obliterating roads and making small fragments bigger, connected pieces.
Yeah, I just follow up with what Dom just said, that that's the principle behind what I referred to as multiple spatial scale reserve design. So you don't want to get caught in the trap of having zones that are disconnected, because if they're disconnected, they erode around the edges, and you lose what you're trying to protect eventually over time. So that multiple spatial scale reserve design can be applied at any scale. You can have large watersheds or multiple watersheds that that maintain large protected areas or core reserves that are then linked with connectivity to similar reserves. But then you have to remember, in between, you still got to maintain ecological integrity, connectivity, and diversity. And that's where bringing the scale down finer, but using the same approach works. So I'm zonation for me has always kind of left gaps in terms of connectivity and maintaining whole systems. By that, I mean whole large forest landscapes.
Thanks, Herb. David, did you want to say anything about zonation before we close?
Yeah, I think that there's a need to recognise the range of strategies that are appropriate in some places and entirely inappropriate in others. So very frequent prescribed burning, for example, based on the Australian experience, maybe once every 5 to 7 years would be appropriate at the margins of urban settlements, the urban interface in some of these inland towns, on the understanding that under extreme conditions, doesn't matter what you've done, you're at risk. And I think that's where you focus and prioritise some of those activities, given that the level of risk reduction is significant, but the effect size is often small. That was what we found with house loss work after the 2009 fires, was that, yes, prescribed burning was significant if it was done repeatedly and it was done close, but it changes the ecosystem when you do that kind of work. It was a significant effect, statistically significant, but the effect size was small. Having said that, I think it's also important to recognise that if you're going to focus your prescribed burning in that way, it means that you don't go to really remote areas and do these kinds of things, and especially in reserves and especially in primary forests. That's a no-no. So I think there are smart ways to think about landscapes and zone your activities relative to the need and objective. And so I really make a plea to Canadians to not make the mistakes that we've made so badly in Australia, and resist the temptation for simple solutions based on the bullshit that comes out of populist mouths, both on your side of the border and on the other side, with the numbskulls that are running that bizarre country across the border from Canada. It's really important.
I got one real quick final point based on what David just said, if I may. Because I work at a global scale. In 2016, we published the first global map of roadless areas on the planet. Based on a buffer around roads, we figured there was only 800,000 places left on the globe that were truly roadless. Think about that. How crisscrossed by development our globe is. We're only talking about 800,000 places. In the US, the roadless area is the rule is under attack. Globally, 28% of 4 billion hectares of forest are primary. That's it. That means the rest of them have some level of active management in them. In the US, 20% of the continental forest, roughly, are mature and old growth. In Canada, in British Columbia, about 3% of the old growth is the largest, oldest treed forest. That's all we got left. We don't need to go into those places. There are so many other places we've already been in. Let's protect what we've got left of the natural world, because that's what's going to get us through this crazy situation of the global extinction and biodiversity crisis that we are causing and leaving for future generations.
Okay, thank you very much. All three of you. We're really grateful for your time and your expertise, and for sticking around to answer some extra questions. I think Michelle is going to wrap it up. Thanks again.
So as Kate mentioned, for those of you in the audience who asked questions that we did not get to, we will do our best to have them answered by the panelists, and then we will email you with those answers. On behalf of Conservation North, I would like to thank the panelists, David, Herb, Dominick, for speaking with us tonight. All the panelists will be receiving a gift made by a DACF artist. Good night, and thank you, everyone.